Hi and welcome back. Let's take a look at some of the history of property investment in the UK and in particular the private rented sector, PRS as it's more commonly known, since the beginning of the 20th century. All properties bought as buy-to-lets are part of the private rented sector in the UK. In the early 1900s, around 90% of all homes were rented. Virtually the only people who owned their own homes were the aristocracy and some of the upper middle classes. Nearly all the working classes lived in rented accommodation, as did most blue-collar workers. My family were mostly farmers. My grandfather was a tenant farmer all his life, and he worked a farm owned by the local lord of the manor. Likewise, my father started off renting his farm, which included cottages for his farm workers, so he was both a tenant and a landlord. Mind you, the cottages were rent-free and went with the job, but if the worker lost his job, he lost his home as well, which was common practice across a number of industries. It still remains the case today with what is called tied housing. Two examples are the clergy and some teachers at boarding schools. Progressively, through the last century, there was a move into home ownership, and by the 1990s, following various government initiatives, such as the Right to Buy scheme, which encouraged home ownership, the rented sector reduced to around 10%, which, at that time, was by far the lowest in Europe. By 2011, as a result of the buy-to-let initiative, the rental sector had grown to around 15%, or nearly 3 million homes. This is similar to the Netherlands, where the private rented sector also represents about 15%, with France and Germany climbing into the 20s and Switzerland is highest of all at over 50%. But compared to the UK, tenants enjoy far greater rights throughout most of Europe, with less stigma attached to renting. This expansion has taken place quite recently. In fact, according to a recent English housing survey, the number of privately rented homes increased by around 1 million between 2005 and 2010. The housing crash of the late 80s, early 90s, together with the recent housing crash 2007 to 2010, have increased nervousness about buying homes. Therefore, the private rented sector is still increasing due to consumer-led demand, but it is still amongst the lowest in Europe. The socio-economic effects of the earlier move into home ownership were huge, principally because people were no longer prepared to leave the home they owned for economic reasons, except perhaps contract workers. If workers were made redundant or lost their jobs, they would rather accept a lower-paid local job or rely on benefit. But today, the private rented sector offers a flexible form of tenure and meets a wide range of housing needs. It contributes to greater labour market mobility and is increasingly the tenure of choice for young people. I remember back in 1986, my 18-year-old secretary bought her first home with her boyfriend. The relationship broke down and she moved back in with Mum and then tried to sell the house for what she had paid for it. The crash had started and she had to take a loss. Today, the average age of first-time buyers is mid to late 30s. The private rented sector was a political football until 1988. The Labour governments regarded private landlords as being little better than rip-off merchants, and making money from housing was regarded as a sin, so anti-landlord legislation was introduced, often retrospectively, which damaged the credibility of and confidence in the private rented sector. This was also partly the result of the Rachman scandal in the 1960s. Rachmanism is now part of the English language, and Google him for more information. Rachman was a landlord in the Notting Hill area of London who bought properties which were let and occupied by sitting tenants. Those are tenants that could not be given notice to quit. He set about persuading them by fair means or foul to leave. Sadly, he used foul means a lot more often than fair, and by getting vacant possession, the value of his properties increased substantially. As a result of his actions, legislation was passed which made eviction, except by a county court bailiff, and harassment illegal, and so it became socially undesirable to be a landlord. If one confessed to being a landlord, one was deemed to be a Rachman, and therefore sometimes a social leper. There was a change of attitude in 1988 when a landlord's right to vacant possession was introduced. Before 1988, a landlord did not have the right to evict a tenant and recover vacant possession of his property simply because he wanted to. For example, he might want to sell it with vacant possession. Owners did not have the right to say, "I want you to leave my property." This right was included in legislation that gave rise to the assured short-hold tenancy, or short assured tenancy in Scotland, which allows the landlord to recover vacant possession at the end of the contractual period, provided that the contractual period is a minimum of 6 months. The courts, by law, have to grant the landlord vacant possession and issue an eviction order if the tenant refuses to leave. Another major change in 1988 was that fair rents were abandoned in favour of market rents. Previously, if a tenant felt that they were being overcharged, they could appeal to the rent tribunal, who would set a fair rent which was fixed for a minimum of 3 years, and after that period, if the landlord wanted to increase the rent, he had to return to the rent tribunal, who could increase the rent if they felt there was good reason. But rises in inflation and interest rates were not good reasons. Also, all future tenancies were subject to the fair rent set by the tribunal. The difference between market rents and fair rents is that whilst the tenant still has the right to appeal against an excessive rent, and the rent tribunal can lower the rent, the reduced rent only applies until the end of the contract or the tenant vacating, whichever is the sooner. Then the landlord can charge the original rent or increase it as he sees fit, and is not bound by the tribunal decision. So a landlord now has the right to recover vacant possession for whatever reason, and subject to a possible short-term reduction is able to charge a market rent. You will also appreciate that fair rents damaged property values, because even new owner landlords were restricted to charging any fair rent that had been set on any property. A tenant's application for a fair rent was a landlord's nightmare and made residential property investment distinctly unattractive. As a result of the changes in 1988, ARLA, the Association of Residential Letting Agents, introduced the buy-to-let initiative in 1996. It was ARLA that coined the term buy-to-let. It was a groundbreaking move. The association persuaded a panel of 7 lenders to lend to potential landlords on 2 criteria. The first was obviously the value or cost of the property, and the panel agreed to lend up to 75%, but it was the second aspect which was groundbreaking, since they all agreed to take future or potential rents into account to determine whether the landlord was able to pay the monthly mortgage payments. Previously, mortgages were based on historic incomes or rents, not future expectations. Rents had to be confirmed by an ARLA agent, who also had to be instructed to let and manage the property. The initiative was launched by ARLA to help recruit letting agents, as they really only had a presence in the southeast of England and London. In any event, the initiative took off like a scolded cat, and within the first 6 months, ARLA received in excess of 180,000 inquiries about buy-to-let from would-be investors, and letting agents joined in droves. The lenders quickly broke ranks, and within 18 months it was possible to buy-to-let without involving an ARLA agent, and that is still the case today. Valuers now confirm or value the rent when valuing the property for mortgage purposes. As a result, today buy-to-let is considered part of mainstream investments. In fact, without buy-to-let, there would be a major crisis in the rented sector, since local authority or council house estates are no longer being built. Whilst housing associations are taking on some of the old local authority properties and tenants, the majority of tenants are housed in the private rented sector by private landlords. This brings us to the end of this little historical review. In the next video, I will summarize all the best and worst bits of property investment. I hope to see you there. Thank you for watching. This is David Humphreys signing off.